At Jefferson University, a prestigious institution known for its excellence in science and engineering, students enrolled in theoretical physics expected rigorous discussions about quantum mechanics and mathematical models. However, on this particular day, something felt different. As students entered the lecture hall, they noticed that instead of equations and formulas, the whiteboard displayed an unusual phrase, "Reevaluating science through a social lens." Some students exchanged puzzled glances, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had signed up for an advanced physics course, not a discussion on social issues. At the front of the class stood Dr. Eleanor Graves, a veteran professor known for her brilliance in physics but also for integrating strong ideological viewpoints into her lectures. Over the years, she had developed a reputation for steering scientific discussions toward broader social narratives, much to the frustration of some students who simply wanted to master the subject. In the back of the room sat Barron Trump, a tall, reserved young man who kept to himself. He was known for his exceptional intellect, but few had actually spoken to him. Those who did knew he had a remarkable mind for mathematics and physics, but he never sought attention or recognition. He was there to learn nothing more, nothing less. Dr. Graves began speaking with her usual confidence, explaining that scientific education needed to evolve to address inequalities in the STEM fields. Some students nodded in agreement, but others remained quiet, hoping the lecture would eventually shift back to physics. Then, Barron raised his hand. Dr. Graves hesitated for a moment. He rarely spoke in class. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Barron Trump sat quietly in the back of the lecture hall, his posture composed, his expression unreadable. While most students barely knew him beyond name recognition, whispers about his intelligence had circulated through the campus. Some said he had a near-perfect academic record. Others claimed he had an IQ of 170. But Barron himself never spoke of such things. He came to class each day for one reason, to learn. Now, as Dr. Eleanor Graves continued her lecture, it became increasingly clear that today's class was not about quantum mechanics as expected. Instead, she was steering the discussion toward social issues in science, making the case that traditional scientific education needed to adapt to reflect societal inequities. Barron's gaze remained fixed on the board, where complex equations should have been. Instead, PowerPoint slides highlighting diversity statistics in STEM fields filled the screen. Some of you, Dr. Graves said, her eyes drifting toward certain students, must understand that privilege, not just merit, plays a role in who succeeds in fields like physics. A tense silence settled over the room. Some students nodded in agreement, while others seemed uncomfortable. A few exchanged nervous glances. They had signed up for a physics course, not a lecture on social justice. Then, Barron's hand slowly rose into the air. A ripple of surprise passed through the class. He was known for his silence, for his preference to work alone. What could he possibly have to say? Dr. Graves hesitated for a brief moment before calling on him, her tone carrying a hint of amusement. "Yes, Mr. Trump?" Barron spoke calmly, his voice even. "Professor, do you believe reducing focus on core physics principles will help or harm students who need a strong education to succeed?" His question was simple but direct, forcing the professor to acknowledge the unintended consequences of her approach. Dr. Graves narrowed her eyes slightly, sensing the challenge. "Mr. Trump, perhaps you, of all people, should recognize that not everyone had access to private tutors or elite prep schools." A few students turned toward Barron, waiting for a reaction. Would he get defensive? Would he argue? Instead, Barron simply nodded. "You're right, Professor. I have had access to excellent education. That's exactly why I believe maintaining rigorous academic standards is important for everyone, regardless of background." The professor's expression hardened. This wasn't the response she had expected. Dr. Graves's expression tightened as Barron Trump's words settled over the classroom. She had expected defensiveness, perhaps even arrogance, but instead, his response was measured and logical. His calm demeanor only made the tension in the room more palpable. For a moment, she simply stared at him, as if reevaluating whether she had underestimated the quiet student in the back. Then, she gave a small, knowing smirk, the kind a teacher gives when they believe they have the upper hand. "Well then, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice laced with condescension, "since you believe so strongly in the importance of traditional academic standards, let's put that belief to the test." With that, she turned to the board and picked up a marker. In swift, confident strokes, she began writing a highly complex quantum mechanics problem, one far beyond the scope of their coursework. As the equation took shape, students began shifting in their seats. A low murmur spread through the room. "Wait, that's graduate-level material," someone whispered. "I don't think we've even covered that technique yet," another muttered. Dr. Graves stepped back and gestured toward the problem, her smirk widening. "Since you're so passionate about maintaining high standards, Mr. Trump, why don't you solve this for us? Unless, of course, you prefer to discuss privilege instead." The challenge was clear. She wasn't just testing his knowledge, she was trying to humiliate him. All eyes turned to Barron. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he stood up, adjusting his blazer slightly, and walked toward the board with an air of quiet confidence. As he took the marker from her outstretched hand, there was no hesitation in his movements. Then, he studied the problem for a few seconds, tilting his head slightly, as if appreciating its complexity rather than fearing it. Before he began, he turned toward the class. "This problem has multiple possible solutions," he said, his voice smooth and composed. "Would you prefer the standard method, or would you like to see a more efficient approach based on Schrödinger's original unpublished notes?" The class froze. Dr. Graves's smirk faltered. "You've read Schrödinger's unpublished work?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. Barron nodded. "In German," he replied simply. "The translations don't quite capture the depth of his methodology." Silence filled the room. And then he turned back to the board, marker poised, ready to begin. The room was completely still as Barron Trump turned back to the board, marker in hand. The equation Dr. Graves had written stretched across nearly the entire surface a graduate-level quantum mechanics problem, meant to be intimidating, meant to expose his supposed arrogance. But Barron didn't look intimidated. He looked intrigued. Taking a moment to analyze the equation, he nodded slightly, as if appreciating its structure rather than feeling threatened by its difficulty. Then, with calm precision, he began writing. "The first step," Barron said, his voice steady, "is to recognize that this problem can be approached using standard quantum integration methods. But there's a more efficient approach, one derived from Schrödinger's original work on wave function collapse." Gasps rippled through the classroom. Barron's hand moved effortlessly across the board. His writing was clear, methodical, each step carefully laid out. Unlike most students who might rush or second-guess themselves, Barron wrote with the confidence of someone who truly understood the subject at its core. Several students began leaning forward in their seats, completely engrossed. Dr. Graves, who had initially crossed her arms, now unconsciously uncrossed them, watching more intently than she probably meant to. Barron continued explaining as he worked. "This next step involves a technique first proposed by Paul Dirac, though his initial formulation was refined by Feynman's path integral approach in the 1940s. It simplifies what appears to be a complex system into something far more manageable." More murmurs spread through the room. One student, Jason Miller, whispered, "I've never seen it explained like this before. It actually makes sense." Another, Maya Lin, quickly pulled out her phone and began recording. Dr. Graves's confident expression wavered. As Barron reached the final stages of the solution, he paused. Then, he turned slightly toward the professor. "There are two ways to finalize this result," he said. "We can proceed with the traditional expansion method, which will take a full board of calculations, or using a variation of the Schrödinger equation applied to this particular integral, we can reach the solution in about 5 steps." He gestured toward Dr. Graves. "Which approach would you prefer?" The classroom fell completely silent. Dr. Graves hesitated. She had set the challenge, expecting to embarrass Barron, but now she was the one caught off guard. Before she could speak, Maya Lin raised her hand from the back. "Could we see both?" she asked, hesitantly at first, then gaining confidence. "This is actually helping me understand the chapter from last week." Several other students nodded. Barron turned back to the board, his face calm but with a small, knowing smile. "Of course," he said, and without hesitation, continued writing. As Barron Trump continued writing on the board, the class sat in stunned silence, watching the true master at work. His movements were precise, his explanations effortless. What had started as an attempt to humiliate him had turned into an unexpected teaching moment, not just for the students, but for Dr. Graves herself. Barron systematically laid out the first method, the traditional approach, step by step. Even students who typically struggled with quantum mechanics nodded in understanding as he explained the reasoning behind each calculation. After finishing the final line of this method, he stepped back and turned to the class. "This is the standard solution," he said, nodding toward the board. "It's effective, but as you can see, it's long and tedious." Then, without missing a beat, he erased half of the board and began the second approach. "This method," Barron continued, "is based on a lesser-known insight from Schrödinger's early unpublished notes, refined by Heisenberg's matrix formulation. By recognizing a key symmetry in the wave function, we can bypass much of the traditional work and arrive at the solution in just a few steps." Within minutes, he had reached the same answer, but in a fraction of the time. A few students actually applauded. Maya Lin, who had been recording the entire time, whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." Dr. Graves, who had stood frozen for most of the demonstration, finally found her voice, but it was no longer filled with smug confidence. How did you?" she started, but stopped herself. Barron simply set the marker down and turned to face her. His expression wasn't arrogant or triumphant. It was patient. "Professor," he said evenly, "math and science don't care about politics or privilege. They care about truth." The room remained silent. Dr. Graves, for the first time in the lecture, had no immediate comeback. Then, before she could react, the classroom door swung open. Dean Patterson entered, his expression serious. "Dr. Graves," he announced, "we need you for an urgent faculty meeting regarding curriculum revisions." The perfect excuse to escape. Dr. Graves turned to leave, regaining some of her composure. "We'll continue this discussion another time," she said quickly. But before she could step away, Barron spoke up once more. "Professor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you issued a challenge. Are you really going to walk away from it?" The tension in the room became electric. Everyone held their breath, waiting for her response. The air in the room was thick with tension as Barron Trump's words settled over the class. Students exchanged glances, some whispering among themselves, others staring at Dr. Graves, waiting for a response. Dr. Graves, still gripping the marker, looked caught between two choices: admit defeat or find a way to regain control. Dean Patterson shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, sensing the awkwardness of the situation. He had stepped in at the perfect moment to give Dr. Graves an easy way out, but Barron had just challenged her integrity in front of the entire class. A moment of silence passed. Then, Barron took a single step forward. His voice was measured, respectful, but firm. "Professor," he said, "when a scientist presents a hypothesis, they must also be willing to test it. You propose that privilege determines success in education, but when given the chance to test pure academic merit, you're choosing to leave. What lesson does that teach?" The class murmured in agreement. Several students pulled out their phones, sensing they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about long after today's lecture. Dr. Graves's jaw tightened. She was losing control of the room, and she knew it. Dean Patterson, clearing his throat, attempted to diffuse the moment. Now, let's not turn this into something dramatic. Dr. Graves has important faculty matters to attend to." Barron didn't break eye contact with Dr. Graves. Or, he said, she could honor the challenge she set. She could solve the problem herself. The tension in the room exploded. Several students gasped. A few muttered under their breath. Others waited eagerly to see what would happen next. Dr. Graves's knuckles whitened as she gripped the marker harder. She looked at the problem she had written, the very one meant to embarrass Barron, and suddenly it felt like a trap she had set for herself. Barron's expression remained patient. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't mocking her. Then he did something unexpected. He held out the marker to her. "Or," he said with a small, knowing smile, "we could solve it together." The room went completely silent. Everyone, including Dean Patterson, waited for Dr. Graves's next move. Dr. Graves stood frozen, staring at the marker Barron Trump had extended toward her. The weight of the moment was palpable: the challenge she had set, the problem she had written, and the student she had underestimated. Now, the entire class was watching, waiting to see if she would take it. Her fingers twitched slightly, but she didn't reach for the marker. Barron's expression remained calm, patient. He had nothing to prove. His work had already spoken for itself. But this wasn't just about solving an equation anymore. It was about something much bigger: academic integrity. Dean Patterson, who had initially entered to rescue Dr. Graves from this uncomfortable situation, now found himself unsure of what to do. His gaze flickered between Barron, the professor, and the students, who were still recording the interaction on their phones. Then, From the middle of the room, a voice broke the silence. "Professor, shouldn't you at least try?" It was Maya Lin, the quiet but sharp-witted student who had been following along closely. Another student, Jason Miller, nodded in agreement. "I mean, if we're here to learn, wouldn't it be good to see how you would approach it?" Dr. Graves's jaw tightened. She was losing them. She knew the truth. She didn't have an answer. Not in the way Barron had. Not with the same clarity. The problem she had written on the board was beyond the course material, something meant to be impossible for an undergraduate to solve. Yet Barron had done it twice, using 2 different methods, and he had taught the class in the process. Her face flushed slightly. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, dropping the marker onto the desk beside her. "This entire display is nothing but arrogance, another privileged student showing off." A few students gasped. Others murmured in disbelief. Barron didn't react. He simply picked up the marker again. "I don't see it that way," he said evenly. "I see it as an opportunity to learn. Science should be about discovering the truth, no matter who it comes from." The class remained dead silent. Then, in a stunning display of composure, Barron turned back to the board and, with effortless precision, completed the solution once again, this time even faster. When he reached the final step, he capped the marker, set it down, and turned back toward Dr. Graves. She said nothing. The power dynamic had completely flipped. For years, she had controlled the classroom, shaping discussions as she saw fit. But today, she wasn't in control anymore. And the students knew it. A heavy silence filled the room as Barron Trump stepped away from the board. His work was complete. The problem was solved, twice and with undeniable clarity. The only person who had anything left to say was Dr. Graves, but she remained motionless, speechless, and visibly unsettled. Then, from the back of the room, Maya Lin raised her hand again. "That actually made sense to me," she said, her voice steady but filled with something unexpected relief. "I've struggled with quantum mechanics all semester, but Barron's explanation just clicked." A few heads nodded. "I came here to learn physics," Jason Miller added, "not to debate privilege or politics. This is the first time in weeks that I actually feel like I understand something." Dr. Graves's eyes darted around the room. She was losing them. For years, she had been the unquestioned authority in her classroom, controlling discussions, shifting focus to topics that aligned with her views. But now that authority was crumbling and Barron hadn't taken it from her, she had lost it herself. Barron, however, wasn't interested in humiliating her. He could have pressed further, could have demanded she solve the problem herself, exposing her lack of preparation. But he didn't. Instead, he extended an olive branch. "Professor," Barron said, his voice calm and measured, "your knowledge of theoretical physics is extensive. I've learned a lot from your lectures." He gestured toward the board. "Perhaps we could focus on that. I'd be happy to assist students after class, reinforcing the concepts you teach." The room went still again. A few students exchanged glances. Was this a way for Dr. Graves to save face? For a long moment, she said nothing. Dean Patterson, who had been watching everything unfold, finally cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said, glancing at Dr. Graves, "this could be a model for other departments as well." Dr. Graves looked at Barron, really looked at him. For the first time, it seemed, she wasn't seeing him as an obstacle but as an asset. And for the first time in her career, she was forced to reconsider what it meant to be a true educator. The room remained silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. Dr. Graves stood there, her face unreadable. Just moments ago, she had been in control, steering the conversation as she always had. But now, the power had shifted not because Barron Trump had taken it from her, but because he had shown something greater than authority, mastery, humility, and leadership. For years, Dr. Graves had believed she was fighting against privilege, pushing for what she thought was fairness in education. But now, standing before a classroom full of students who had just witnessed true academic excellence, she realized something startling. She had become the very thing she claimed to oppose. She wasn't encouraging learning, she was controlling it. A slow breath escaped her lips as she looked around the room. Students weren't just engaged, they were excited, inspired in a way she hadn't seen before. Her eyes met Barron's. Then, in a moment no one expected, she straightened her posture and spoke. "I've made a mistake." The murmurs in the classroom stopped immediately. "I've spent years focusing on what I thought was the bigger picture," Dr. Graves admitted, her voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "But in doing so, I stopped seeing the students right in front of me. I let my personal beliefs shape how I teach, rather than letting the pursuit of knowledge lead the way. The students listened, some still shocked at the sudden change in tone. She turned toward Barron. "You didn't just solve that problem today," she said. "You reminded me of what true education should be about." A slow, stunned silence hung over the classroom. Then, one by one, students started clapping. At first, it was just Maya Lin and Jason Miller, but soon the entire class joined in. Dean Patterson watched intently, sensing an opportunity. "Perhaps," he said, stepping forward, "this could serve as a model for improving other programs as well." Dr. Graves hesitated, then gave a small nod. Perhaps it could. For the first time in her career, she was no longer trying to prove a point. She was willing to learn. And Barron, true to his nature, simply nodded in return, not as a victor, but as a student who had always believed in the power of knowledge above all else. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened in Dr. Graves's physics class spread across campus. But instead of becoming a controversy, it became something far more meaningful, a turning point in the way students, and even faculty, approached education. Attendance in the advanced physics course tripled. Students weren't just coming to learn about quantum mechanics, they were coming because they had witnessed something rare, a classroom where true merit mattered more than ideology. Dr. Graves, humbled by the experience, returned to her passion for teaching physics the way it was meant to be taught, without bias, without personal agendas, but with a renewed commitment to excellence. And Barron Trump? He remained the same, sitting quietly in the back of the room, helping struggling students, never seeking recognition but always pursuing knowledge. This story teaches us something far more important than just a debate over physics. It teaches us that real intelligence is not about proving others wrong, but about lifting everyone up. Education should never be about power struggles or personal agendas. It should be about truth, curiosity, and the courage to stand up for what's right. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? Was it inspiring, thought-provoking, or something you've experienced in your own life? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another video like this. And remember, knowledge belongs to those who seek it. See you in the next one.